My name is Zofia Wodniecka. I'm from Jagiellonian University in Krakow. And I would like to start by saying that it's a great honor and joy for me to welcome Professor Judith Kroll at this online event. I'm really convinced that she really doesn't need much introduction. We are all aware of her great contribution to cognitive science and the field of bilingualism. She has played a crucial role in pioneering cognitive and interdisciplinary research on bilingualism. She was one of the founding editors of the journal Bilingualism, Language and Cognition, and is an author of many seminal papers in the field, as well as the editor of famous tutorials and handbooks on bilingualism. Currently, Judith Kroll is a distinguished professor in the Department of Language Sciences at the University of California, Irvine. But before, she has held several other positions, and the longest one, I believe, at Pennsylvania State University. With colleagues at Penn State, she is now a principal investigator on a National Science Foundation PIRE grant, which stands for Partnership for International Research and Education. And this grant aims to develop an international research network and program of training to enable language scientists at all levels to pursue research abroad on the science of bilingualism. But most of all, Judith Kroll is an amazing and supportive, generous mentor and colleague. Knowing how important it is to promote young scholars in the field, she was one of the founding organizers of Women in Cognitive Science, a group developed to promote the advancement of women and all young scholars in the cognitive sciences. Judith Kroll holds multiple prestigious awards and fellowships. She's also on the advisory board of the Multilingual Mind network that is organizing today's event. When we first started discussing the possibility of Judith giving this special address during the Krakow Multimind Training School, it really looked like finally, after many years, we'll host Judith in Krakow. This visit has been rescheduled several times before. And really no one thought at that time that the world will get online by now. And as Theo has said, thanks to this online event, we can have audience as broad as we have today. Judy, we are thrilled to have you with us. And without further ado, let me give this virtual floor to you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me and for the very, very generous introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see this? Yeah, okay. And I just want to say at the start that one of my major life flaws is that I'm unable to curb my enthusiasm. So I know it has some positive consequences, but one of them is I have too many slides. So I'm going to do my best to try to give you a sense of why we're excited about the topic of what I'm going to be talking about today, the fate of the native language and second language learning. And I'll just say that I know we're getting a late start. It's already after 7:15 here. So I will do my best to try to keep this within an hour, and I will be happy to also, I know this is being recorded, I'll be happy to share my slides if I end up skipping some things towards the end if there's not enough time. I'm going to make sure I can, okay. So first, just very quickly, I owe many, many thanks to many, many people over a long period of time who are both students, former students, colleagues, collaborators. I spent many years of my career at Penn State University, which looks a bit like the background that Zofia has in her virtual background. It is not a place where there are many bilinguals. So if you are committed to doing research on bilingualism, you need to have friends and colleagues who generously share their willingness to collaborate with you. And I have been very, very lucky in this regard. And as Zofia mentioned, we have an international network for research on bilingualism that includes Jagiellonian University. And this summer we are, like all of you, we are online. I just want to say before we begin that this is Bastille Day 2020. And I think we need to say just one word quickly about the world before we start. And at this time of global crises in both health and government, ours and many of yours, we are really the lucky ones who can indulge our science and look away from the world for just a moment. But it's very important that we not forget our responsibilities, both to each other, to all of us around, and to the freedoms that we must protect. Okay, I'll start with something that is absolutely preaching to the choir here. More people in the world are bilingual than monolingual, but until very recently, more recently than you might think, most research on language and cognition really examined only monolingual speakers of a single language, and typically speakers of English as the native language. Bilinguals were considered to be special, and special in the sense of precious, as if bilingualism was a boutique topic, something that only people in a very rarefied, special context might be interested in studying. The assumption in past research was that monolingual speakers were really the model subjects of study, and the native language itself provided an adequate basis on which universal principles might be generalized. So bilinguals were put in a group with other language users, like brain damaged patients, children with language disorder, deaf individuals who use a sign language to communicate, understanding that each of those groups holds genuine interest for the field, but was historically not considered to be the primary source of evidence for the purpose of adjudicating the classic important debates about representation and processing of language in the mind and the brain. So why has there been resistance to bilingualism as the norm? There are many reasons. We could spend an entire session talking just about what those reasons might be. But one of them is that on this slide are familiar to all of you. These are just very, very classic, well-known data on both speech and on grammar that show that there are persistent and reliable and very clear age of acquisition effects in the accentedness of speech of individuals who acquire a language past earliest childhood, and deficits in the grammar of individuals who also acquire the second language late. So what it suggests is that bilingualism might be a problem, and particularly for late acquirers of an L2. And for some, that's been taken to suggest that the L2 is fundamentally different than the native language, separate from the native language, with properties that may be enabled by domain general cognitive processes, but also constrained by the hypothesized inability to access all of the linguistic representations typically associated with the native language. And so in this representation, which could be interpreted a number of different ways, what you see is you have a speaker with a very neat L1. Everything lines up very, very clearly. And then you have a speaker with what I'm using as a metaphor for a messy L2. And so the idea traditionally was that late bilinguals may really be special, with a sort of mixed language system that includes a full native language that's very neat and clean, and what I'm calling in non-scientific language, a funky L2. The idea is that bilinguals should be functionally monolingual in the language in which they started, in their native language. And that account we would expect that the L1, the native language, should transfer to the L2, but we wouldn't expect much transfer in the other direction. The L2 shouldn't have much effect on the L1. Now, another reason that this view is held, that monolingualism is the norm, is that there are many places in the world, like the US, where monolingualism is overwhelmingly the norm. These are some data from a report by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2017. And what you can see is that almost 80% of the adult population in the US is monolingual with English only. The distribution of speakers across the country is quite varied, but in many places in the US, we have English only. Now, more than a decade ago, actually 15 years ago, on the 125th anniversary of the journal Science, there was an editorial published that identified the top 125 questions to be answered in the next 25 years of research in all of science. And given that we are now 15 years into this, I'd say we've done a pretty good job. If you look at the graph on the right, this is a little bit of data from Web of Science that shows the research articles published on bilingualism between 1993 and 2012. And as we all know, there has been an explosion of research on bilingualism. And there is a new attitude about bilingualism in the fields in which we work. The language and learning sciences have come to see that bilingualism is really a tool for revealing the workings of language, the mind, and the brain, as well as being a topic of interest in its own right. So the goal of what I want to try to do today, very quickly, with too many slides, is that I want to try to ask what we've learned, and I want to try to promote the idea that we can begin to identify a hypothesis about the native language that may require that we change our view about what it means to be bilingual and what it might even mean to be monolingual. And so what we know is that the recent neuroscience evidence has really called into question the presence of hard constraints in L2 learning. And there's evidence that proficiency in L2 may turn out to be more important than age of acquisition. We also know, and one of the very few observations that's very rarely disputed in this literature, is that the joint activation of the two languages creates dynamics where there are interactions between the two languages, and that those interactions change cognition and they change the neural mechanisms that support cognition and language itself. And critically, and for the point of my talk today, I'm going to argue that proficient bilinguals are not monolingual in their native language, suggesting that the native language itself is not so privileged. It is open to the influence of second language learning, to the influence of the second language, and it's open to the dynamics and changes that occur as those influences occur during learning and during language use. In particular, we have reasons to think that competition across the two languages may reshape the networks that support each of them. So the idea that I'm going to examine in this talk is that regulation of the native or dominant language may be critical for both proficient bilingual performance and for new adult L2 learning. So the idea is that the native language may change to enable fluent L2 use, that successful adult language learners may be individuals who are able to acquire the skill to regulate their native language and negotiate the cross-language competition that characterizes proficient bilingualism. And as a result, and again, this is non-scientific language that I'm going to intrude, the L1 may take a hit. The idea is that there may actually be processing costs that slow the first language down, that make native language processing and performance more error-prone, that make learners initially less sensitive to some features of the native language, but that ultimately open the native language to the influences of the L2. We hypothesize that acquiring regulation skills in the native language may in fact be partly responsible for some of the cognitive consequences associated with bilingualism and that have drawn a great deal of attention and controversy in the recent literature. So how do the mind and brain accommodate the presence of two languages? I'm not going to review today the evidence on cross-language activation. I think most of you are familiar with that. And there is, as I said earlier, this is one of the few issues about which there is very little dispute. And the idea that both languages become active regardless of the requirement to use one language alone. And that seems to happen when bilinguals are listening to speech, when they're reading, and when they're planning speech themselves. And these cross-language interactions can be seen at every level. They can be seen at the lexical level, they can be seen at the level of the grammar, they can be seen at the level of the phonology. And of course, in the context of my talk today, I'm not going to have time to go into all of the background research, but this is a very, very rich area of the past research and very interesting to consider how different levels of language processing may differently reveal these cross-language interactions. So the new hypothesis is that the native or dominant language requires regulation, that we have this mental juggling, and that juggling creates parallel activation that has consequences for bilinguals. A lot of the consequences for cognition have been the focus of recent discussion. Here, I'm going to focus more on how those interactions may affect the native language itself. And so many past studies and a very long tradition in second language acquisition has focused on the way in which the more dominant native language, the L1, may affect the less dominant or newly learned L2. And what's striking in the research that we see is that, yes, we see effects of L1 and L2. We see them for proficient speakers as well as learners. We see it for speakers whose languages are structurally distinct, like Chinese and English or American Sign Language and English. And we see it, again, at every level of language processing for the lexicon, the phonology, and the grammar. My goal today is to turn the tables and to say, absolutely, we see these effects from L1 to L2, but what about the effects from L2 to L1? And when do these effects come online? And I'm going to start with a study in 2015 that in some ways took us by surprise. There is a literature that, again, I'm not going to review today, using ERPs and showing that the work of Lee Osterhout and colleagues at University of Washington has shown that when individuals learn a second language as adults, that we begin to see the second language come online very, very quickly. After really minimal instruction. We often don't see it in behavior, but we do see it in brain activity in the ERPs. And so the question in this study that Kinsey Bice was the lead author on, Kinsey was a graduate student at Penn State who is now a postdoc at University of Washington. She asked the question of whether or not individuals who are monolingual, the study took place in Pennsylvania in a very monolingual English environment, whether monolingual speakers who wanted to learn Spanish and who were enrolled in Spanish classes at Penn State would begin to change as they took the Spanish class, as they began to be exposed to Spanish. And so the question in this study is not about their Spanish so much, it's about their English. And these are all native English speakers. And so what she did is she asked them to perform a lexical decision task, simply decide, is this a word or not in English, their native language. And the words included words that were cognates with Spanish, like tomato and tomate, or words that were not cognates, like book and libra. And the question was, would the newly acquired Spanish come to influence their performance in English, their native language? And she did this by simply asking them to perform lexical decision with a little button press. And so she looked at the data behaviorally. Behaviorally, they didn't look any different than monolinguals. The learners looked very monolingual. There was no effect of cognate status on L1 lexical decision. The critical question is what happens in their brains? And what she found is that with just a little bit of exposure, and this is just a little tiny snippet of the ERP data looking at CZ, just the electrode right in the middle of your head. And what she found is that as individuals began to acquire Spanish, and intermediate learners of Spanish in Pennsylvania are not proficient Spanish speakers, to be clear about that. They're living in a very monolingual English environment. They've learned a little bit of Spanish, but what you can see is that what's emerging is there's beginning to be an effect of cognate status on English, their native language. The native language is coming to be affected by the second language, even in this environment. And so the idea is that becoming bilingual may not really just be about learning the L2, but it also may be about learning how the L1 changes in this process. Now, showing that these effects of L2 on L1 occur is a first step, but it's not really an indication of any kind of regulation. It only shows that there's sensitivity, that there's spillover from the second language to the first. And so the question we asked is whether we can show that the L1 is actually used differently in response to the L2. And there are two contexts in which I'm going to argue that the native language may take a hit. One is when learners are immersed in an L2 environment during study abroad or travel. And another is when bilingual, proficient bilingual speakers speak their native language after they've just spoken the L2, either briefly or after a while. I'm going to argue in the tradition from research on memory and learning in the cognitive literature that what we're calling a hit to the native language may really be what Bob and Elizabeth Bjork have called a desirable difficulty for L2 speakers. That is, having a cost during initial learning may have the consequence of having a benefit to later memory and later performance. So one way to examine this is to look at what happens during immersion abroad. In our first foray into immersion abroad, we looked at students who were doing a study abroad experience in Salamanca in Spain. They were American college students whose L1 was English, and they were in Spain to study Spanish. And we compared the performance of a group of immersed second language learners who were all at a relatively intermediate level. They were not proficient in Spanish, but they had just enough to qualify to go abroad. And we compared them with a group in the classroom at Penn State in this very monolingual context, who were studying Spanish as a second language. And what we found in this study is that the native language, English, was suppressed when learners were immersed in the L2 environment. And I'll just give you a little illustration of how we did that. We asked people, we performed a set of different psycholinguistic tasks, but the one that I have illustrated on this slide is a graph of verbal fluency data from a semantic category verbal fluency task, where individuals are given the name of a category, like in this example, fruits, and what you need to do is in the next 30 seconds, you need to generate as many exemplars of fruits as you can think of. And what we did is we did it both in L1, which was English for these intermediate learners of Spanish, and we did it in L2 in Spanish. The first result of interest and importance is the result on the right for Spanish. And you can see that the black bar is greater than the open bar. What does that mean? It means that students who are immersed in Spain can produce more Spanish. That's really a good thing, or otherwise someone is wasting a lot of money sending students abroad to study. They're actually acquiring more Spanish. But the critical result for us was on the left. And these are the data for English. And what you see, first of all, is that these are all native English speakers who are only intermediate learners. They all produce more English than Spanish, and we would expect that. But the critical finding was that the students who are studying abroad, the filled bar, are producing less English in this context than those who are in the classroom in Pennsylvania. So is this attrition? We don't think so. We think that this is a normal dynamic associated with language learning that modulates the activity of the native language during the process of L2 learning. And so this suggests that there was some suppression or inhibition of the L1 during this process. And I will say that we did follow this up when they returned from study abroad. So this was not a long-term hazard to study abroad. This was a benefit. They maintained their advantage in Spanish, but they recovered their ability in English. More evidence of a hit to the L1 comes from a line of research that you're very, very familiar with, because there has been a small cottage industry of research on language switching and what happens when, in response to a cue, individuals produce words in their L1 or their L2. The data on the left are the ClassSec report from Moiter and Allport in 1999, and we see that there is a consequence of switching languages, but that consequence is greater for the L1. The data on the right are from an old study that we did in the Netherlands, where we looked at language mixing, and we see a very similar story here. The work in Tommy Golan's lab at UCSD has been investigating the differences in these contexts in some detail, but the main point for our story today is that what you see is that when bilinguals, and the bilinguals on the right, who were Dutch English bilinguals in the Netherlands, who were quite proficient in English as an L2. And what you see is that when you mix the two languages, that it has very little consequence for the L2. Whereas for the L1, we see this hit again. We see that these Dutch speakers of English, when they speak Dutch, which was their L1, are now very, very slow to name pictures in Dutch. And not only are they slow and slower than when the naming in Dutch is blocked on its own, but they're slower to speak Dutch than they are to speak English, their L2. And so what this shows is that there's a reverse of their language dominance, something that I'm going to come back to in just a moment. And we then asked whether or not we could see these effects in brain activity. The initial learning study that we had done to ask how quickly this all comes online suggested that brain activity might be more sensitive than behavior. And in this study with Maya Misra and Tomei Guo and Susan Bob, we simply asked, what was the consequence of speaking your native language after you had just spoken the L2 for a while? This was a study on lexical production, where we examined the consequences of language blocking. A very simple experiment. We simply name a set of pictures in L1 and then in L2, or another group of participants named in L2 and then in L1. And the participants were relatively proficient Chinese English bilinguals who were dominant in Chinese as their L1. And what we might expect is we might expect that the order of speaking might or might not have any consequence, but of note, in this study, we repeated the same pictures. When we repeat the same item twice, we typically expect to see some form of repetition priming, some form of benefit from having just seen the object earlier. And the question we asked in this study is, would there be a benefit on the repetition that was independent of the order in which the languages were spoken? And what we found was that that benefit depended on the order. the data for L2, and again, this is a little tiny bit of the ERP data for CZ, and the critical distinction here is between what happens upon repetition in the second language or the first. In the second language, you can see the red here is the L2 when it follows the L1. The blue is when the L2 is seen on its own initially prior to a repetition, and you can see that there is a reduction of negativity when the L2 follows the L1. So for the second language, if you've just already identified that object in your native language, you benefit. You see less negativity, a pattern that is typically associated with what we would think of as priming or facilitation. The pattern for the native language was the opposite. What we found for the native language, which is Chinese in this study, what we found is that these Chinese speakers showed greater negativity for their L1 when it followed speaking the L2, English. So when they spoke English and then had to speak their native language, we saw that there is a cost. There appears to be increased negativity, a pattern that has been associated with inhibitory processing. Now, we thought that if this pattern is something that bilinguals simply experience periodically when they're planning speech and then kind of get over it, you might think that if you then go back and speak L1 for a while, so you speak L2, then you speak L1, and then you have an opportunity to speak your native language over an extended period, you might think you would recover. And the really interesting finding in this study is that they didn't recover. Well, they did eventually recover. So it's not, I've sometimes made jokes about hoping no one will report us to our IRB. But the point is that they do eventually recover, but this is a persistent effect. This has the time course of this effect is with them for quite a while once they've spoken L2. This is very briefly, I'm going to just go through this very quickly. We've replicated this behaviorally in a study looking at Japanese English bilinguals who are highly dominant in Japanese as the native and dominant language. These were Japanese English bilinguals who are living in the US but had maintained their dominance. They can produce much more on a category fluency task in Japanese than they can in English. They rate themselves as being more proficient in Japanese than in English. We do the same task. We order the pictures so that they either name in their L1 and then their L2 or in the opposite order. And what do we find? We find that if they speak the L1 and then the L2, we find the usual privilege associated with the native language. If you speak your L1 first and then your L2, you're fast in producing the pictures names in your native language. You're slower in the less dominant language. This is not any big surprise. The surprise, and again, what has received a lot of focus in some recent research in the literature from the Golan Lab, and you see the recent de Klerk paper et al. in press, that you can observe this dominance switch. And so the very same people, when they have to speak their dominant language, Japanese, following English, are now very, very slow. They're slower to speak Japanese than they are to speak English. We have effectively reversed their normal language dominance simply by having them speak their L2 for just a little while. And we have, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but we have fMRI evidence that really suggests the same thing. We see distinct patterns of neural activation, and we see that it is always critically, I'm not going to go through the details here, but the main result is that it's always the native language that's more effective. So with even brief exposure to the L2, production in the L1 is altered. Is it attrition? We think not. We think it's the ordinary dynamics of bilingualism. When might it become attrition is a very interesting issue, and one that a number of people have been considering in more detail. So when is extended use of the L2 without the L1, then producing results that would suggest that there is some permanently altered situation. The studies that I'm presenting here suggest that there is a dynamic flow back and forth. So these are individuals who are adjusting or regulating their native language. Do you need to use the L2 to see these consequences? There's some evidence in the literature, including some from our own lab and a study by Parker Jones and colleagues that suggests that looking at imaging data suggests that you see differential brain activation during L1 picture naming, even if the bilinguals have not just spoken the L2. So there may be some enduring consequences of these dynamics as well. I would stop short at saying that these enduring consequences are related to claims about attrition. It's something that we might return to in discussion. We also see inhibition, what we think may be inhibition of the L1, in another context that's received a lot of attention and very, very important finding, results from Ellen Bialystok's lab, from others. I know I saw that Thomas Bach is here and his work with Sirvana Aladi on individuals who are bilingual and develop dementia has shown that in studies across the world, we see that bilinguals seem to be diagnosed with dementia symptoms if they're going to develop dementia about 4 to 5 years later than monolinguals. And this result has really been taken to be a very important representation of the way in which bilingualism may provide some neuroprotection. Now, what's interesting in the slide here is that the studies that have looked at what happens to their language at the point of being diagnosed is that it suggests that when bilingual patients are diagnosed with dementia, they seem no longer able to speak their L2. And you might think, well, wait a second, maybe it's just because the L2 is weaker, maybe it's because the L2 is acquired later, but the point is that there's the possibility, and this is really speculation at this point, the possibility that what's happened is that the use of L2 requires the regulation of the native language. If, and this is again the hypothesis, if what happens at the point of dementia being diagnosed is that the L1 can no longer be regulated, no longer be appropriately controlled, then in fact it may become difficult or impossible to speak the L2. It's a hypothesis that I think will be very interesting to explore in the future. So the claim that I and others have made is that the native language is not the Rock of Gibraltar. It's not as privileged as we thought. That we see that these cross-language interactions come to change the native language for proficient bilinguals as well as for learners. The two languages come to converge with one another, and they largely sit in the same place in the brain. And so this suggests that a monolingual native speaker model may not be the goal of L2 learner. The L2 learner needs to become a bilingual speaker of the L1, and we need to consider what that might mean. There are a number of interesting demonstrations in the literature, and again, I'm not going to be able to go into this in a lot of detail, suggesting that the kind of regularity, rule-based systems that are involved at both the lexical level, at the level of the grammar, and at the level of the phonology may be disrupted during this stage of during second language learning and once individuals become proficient bilinguals. This is a study from Roxana Botezatu's lab looking at a result that's a very sort of apparently stable feature of English, which is that in English, as all of you who speak English as an L2 know, is that English has this wretched feature, which is that we have all of these irregular words. And so if you are learning to speak English and your native language is a regular language, you have to adjust to be able to learn how to speak exception words. And basically what she's found is that that process of mapping spelling to sound in your native language is momentarily disrupted during early stages of second language learning. Again, that mapping process may take a hit in the L1 during these early stages. And a number of labs have been looking at the effect on the grammar. We heard Antonella Saraci in a talk yesterday talk about pronouns, and Julie Ducius's work at Penn State. She's been looking at the way the grammar may be disrupted, or disrupted may be the wrong word, but may be modified as a function of exposure to L2. This was a study looking at relative clause attachment. So you had sentences like, Peter fell in love with the daughter of a psychologist who studied in California. And the question is, who studied in California? If you're a native English speaker, you tend to prefer to attach low. If you're a native Spanish speaker, you tend to prefer to attach high. And so you see these different parsing preferences. The main result and the point is that in the native language, which for these speakers was Spanish, and these are highly proficient Spanish speakers who have not attrited in Spanish, they're using Spanish, but they're immersed in English. What happens is they begin to parse like English speakers, but not only for English, also for their Spanish. So the point is that the way the grammar is used in the L2 begins to affect the way the grammar is being used in the L1. It permeates this native language privilege, so to speak. And so these results suggest that you see these L2 effects early in learning. They may reflect the dynamics of language change. Our hypothesis is that differences in the ability to regulate may really be critical in predicting language learning success and cognitive outcomes. And that hit to the L1 may be a desirable difficulty for L2 speakers. So we can investigate the hit, and this is a study that you saw before, and that should not be there. The question is, how can we now look at that to understand how the regulation is operating? We have shown that in studies where individuals have to predict what's coming up next during language processing in their L1, in their L2 rather, that they are affected by the ability to control their L1. I'm not going to go into the details of the study for now. But we can also look at new language learning. We can ask the question of, so if a person comes to learn a new language, what has experience as a bilingual done to them to affect new language learning? There's evidence that bilinguals are better language learners than monolinguals. And the question is, you might say, well, why? Well, bilinguals have experience learning a language that monolinguals do not, learning a new language. You might speculate that bilinguals, by virtue of claims about enhanced executive function or other cognitive processes, may come to the table for new language learning with a very different cognitive repertoire than monolinguals. The hypothesis that we explored in the study that I'm going to show you suggests that some of the benefits, and I want to be modest about this and cautious, some of the benefits in new word learning may reflect this regulation of the L1. This is a study conducted with Carrie Bogolsky and Kinsey Weiss at Penn State. And what we did is we had a group of bilinguals and a group of monolinguals. And I will say at Penn State, it's possible to study monolinguals. There are true monolinguals. Many of you live in contexts in the world where that's not possible. We asked the question of whether English-Spanish bilinguals, so native English speakers, but who are highly proficient in Spanish as an L2, and these are for the most part individuals who have studied abroad in a Spanish-speaking country, individuals who are graduate students in a Spanish department and hope to become professors of Spanish. They're highly proficient in Spanish, but they are native English speakers living in a very monolingual English environment. And what we did is we taught them 60 novel words in Dutch. And why was Dutch chosen? Well, there's very little Dutch in their environment. Neither the bilinguals nor the monolinguals in this study had any prior experience with Dutch or German, so the Dutch words were equally novel for both groups. And what we did in the task is we had them see a Dutch word and name the English translation. Very, very simple. You see the word fiets, which those of you who know some Dutch or have been to the Netherlands know is a very, very common object in the Netherlands. It's a bicycle. And what you get then is the word in English. So your task is simply see the word fiets, you get the English translation, and your task is you have up to 5 seconds to just say the name in English. You do not have to pronounce the Dutch. And we had people learn these pairings of Dutch and English. And then they would just have to say the word in English, bike. And we compared a group of English-Spanish bilinguals with monolingual English speakers. And they were pretty closely matched on a set of different features, including their age, over sessions there. And you can see that the monolinguals rate themselves in NEL2 as very, very low on a 10-point scale, whereas the English-Spanish bilinguals are clearly English dominant, but they rate themselves as having proficiency in their L2 Spanish. And so both of these groups learned the Dutch words via English, their native language. What happened in the study is we got a result that we thought was terrible. We got a result that really blew us away. We got a result we thought, I have to say, the first moment we looked at these data, I thought there was something wrong in the R script. You see how the green bars are really high relative to the gray bars? This is the time that the bilinguals were taking to say the English word relative to the time the monolinguals were taking to say the English word. The bilinguals were really slow to name these words. 1400 milliseconds is forever to name a word in your native language. And over study sessions, they got faster, but they were still very, very slow. So there was something very odd about this. We then look at what happens at tests. At tests, we give them a lexical decision task in Dutch, and this is a measure of D prime, of their sensitivity in the lexical decision task. What do we find? We find that there is an advantage. You see how the green bar is greater than the gray bar. The bilinguals are advantaged relative to the monolinguals. They've learned more Dutch. And so the question was, why were they so slow? And we then thought, well, maybe we just happened on a group of people. Maybe we sampled a group of bilinguals who just happened to be slow. And we needed to ask whether this was simply a strange feature of this group or whether it was something about the learning strategy that they adopted. And what we had done, luckily in this study, is that we had given them a picture naming task in English to assess proficiency. And what we found is that when we asked them to name pictures, just simple pictures in their L1, they're just naming in English. And what you can see is the monolinguals and the bilinguals are exactly the same. There is no disadvantage for the bilinguals in speaking. There is a cost when they are learning, not when they are just simply speaking. We then did this study, we replicated the study with a group of Spanish-English bilinguals for whom learning the Dutch via English was their L2, and for a group of Chinese-English bilinguals. And what did we find? They didn't show any of these advantages. We only found this advantage in Dutch word learning for the English-Spanish bilinguals who are learning via their L1. And suggesting to us that this very slow behavior when they were studying was actually a manifestation of language regulation. So we don't see it for bilinguals learning via the L2. We don't want to rule out the idea that there may be some other cognitive mechanisms that are important here. But what we think is that this is an example of a desirable difficulty that bilingualism may impose, that learning to regulate the L1 may have some consequences that sometimes slow people down, may produce more errors, but that it falls into and is generally congenial with the kind of phenomena that have been reported more generally in the learning literature, in the cognitive literature, on the testing effect, on why people benefit from testing, on the spacing versus massing studies, on learning new information in mixed versus block formats. In fact, individuals much prefer learning new information when it's blocked rather than interleaved or mixed, but the mixed produces a much better learning outcome. So bilingual experience itself may create some desirable difficulties for learning, and we think one of them may be a reflection of these L1 regulation effects. So, okay, so where does this come from? What are bilinguals doing that might affect regulation and the coordination of cognitive resources? In the time that I have remaining, which is only a few minutes, we did start late, so I'm going to give myself just a few more minutes. But just to say that I'm not going to have time to go into all of these very rich areas of research that are now emerging in the field, but they are all worthy of discussion. There's a lot of work on code switching. Some bilinguals code switch with one another. That could very easily affect what bilinguals are learning about how to regulate their L1. There is emerging research on social networks and language decision-making. How are bilinguals affected by contexts where a decision might have to be made about whether or not it's possible to speak the L1 or with whom? We've already seen some evidence on language immersion. And then I'm going to end in a few minutes with some evidence on linguistic diversity of the environment, something that we tend not to think about very much in all of these studies of bilingualism. So some bilinguals code switch and others do not. And as we've seen, some bilinguals are dominant in their native language, others become dominant either momentarily or over a long period of time in a second language. Some bilinguals live in a context where others are similarly bilingual, others do not. So if you are bilingual and you're a student at Penn State, you are immersed. If you're speaking English as second language, you're constantly having to monitor the environment to think about who else speaks your L1. And so the hypothesis here is that we may see in the variation of bilingual experience that there are different requirements for this L1 regulatory process. And I want to very, very briefly just mention a study that Annie Beatty Martinez and Christian Navarro-Torres spearheaded to examine the idea that these different contexts in which bilingualism occur may be really crucial for understanding how these regulatory mechanisms and how these control mechanisms are engaged. This was a study of highly proficient Spanish-English bilinguals, and these bilinguals were all native Spanish speakers. They were all highly proficient in English as a second language, but they lived in different environments. One group lived in Granada, Spain, where the two languages tend to be used separately, and they tend not to code switch with one another very much. Others lived in San Juan, Puerto Rico, where either language can be used opportunistically. Code switching is frequent, and the two languages are used in many different contexts. And then we returned to State College, Pennsylvania, where many of us have spent a lot of time and collected a lot of data. In State College, Pennsylvania, as I've said a number of times, we have a presence of a very monolingual English environment. So if you are a native Spanish speaker who's come to live in State College, you may code switch with other similar Spanish-English bilinguals. But in fact, you are constantly having to monitor the environment for who speaks Spanish and who doesn't, because you cannot assume that everyone in your environment will speak your native language. In this study, we gave participants the AXCT task, and again, I'm going to do not do proper attention to all of this, but just to say that I know that many of you have some familiarity with these different executive function tasks that have been used to examine the way in which inhibitory control may occur. The point of the AXCT is that individuals see a sequence of letters and have to say whether or not the sequence that began with the QA is ended with the probe X. Most of the time it is leading to the ability to generate predictions about what's coming up, but some of the time it's not. The task has been used to separate the contributions of proactive and reactive control mechanisms, meaning we can look at the extent to which there is planning in advance for proactively for what's likely to occur versus letting 1,000 flowers bloom and then later responding to what might need to be addressed and controlled. The question here was whether this kind of cognitive mechanism might differ for bilinguals who nominally are the same kind of bilinguals. They're all proficient Spanish-English speakers, but they're now in these different contexts. And basically there are many different results in this study, but I'm just going to show a critical result. Whoops, that's the AXCT. The critical result is that these people in State College, Pennsylvania, who were monitoring their environment show greater reliance on context. We called it varied context in State College because they don't know with whom they can speak which language. And so what we find is that these immersed bilinguals in this varied context are showing greater proactive reliance, and that greater proactive reliance is associated with picture naming accuracy in Spanish, they're L1. And so the idea here is that the interactional context is going to influence the way these mechanisms are engaged, and that in fact, the regulation of the L1 is going to interface with these more domain general cognitive mechanisms, which is a whole other topic of discussion that is receiving a lot of attention in the current literature, but it suggests the idea that's been proposed by David Green and Jubin Abouchalebi, that what we have is adaptive control, that bilinguals adapt, that they accommodate to their environment to take into account the way they need to control the two languages. And in line with what I've been talking about today, the idea that that very much affects the native language, which for these people was Spanish. I'm going to skip this next study, which shows something very similar, and end with because we can't ever completely rid ourselves of Pennsylvania. I'm going to end with a study that we think is pointing in some new and interesting directions about the native language. So not only is the regulation of the native language important for bilinguals, but it may turn out that it's important for monolinguals as well in ways that we really didn't appreciate before. And so this is the study where we discovered quite serendipitously that variation in linguistic context appears to be critical for monolinguals when they're learning a new language. So I had the opportunity, as many of you know, to move from Pennsylvania after many, many years to Southern California. And Pennsylvania, if you didn't know before my talk today, you know now, is very monolingual English. Southern California is quite linguistically diverse. We have many heritage speakers. We have many speakers who have a home language of Spanish or Mandarin or Korean or Vietnamese. And what we have in both contexts is you have some monolinguals who simply have not acquired a second language by virtue of their particular individual history. And what we did, was part of Kinsey Bice's dissertation, because she moved with me from Pennsylvania, from Penn State to Southern California when I moved. She had the daunting task of having to collect half of her PhD data in State College and half of it in Riverside, California. And the study was not about monolinguals. The study was about bilingual language learners and bilinguals learning a second language. And the task that she gave them was a very hard task that I'm not going to go into detail about today, about learning Finnish vowel harmony, the Finnish vowel harmony rule. And what she did is she measured behavior and she measured EEG. And what happened was that there was a remarkable serendipitous finding as a function of our move of the lab from one location to the other. It turned out the linguistic diversity in Southern California mattered for the way the monolinguals in California learned relative to the monolinguals in Pennsylvania. And these are the results for the two groups. They were given a series of learning trials to learn the Finnish vowel harmony. And the truth is that everybody learns. Everyone learns in Pennsylvania. They learn in California. They learn. You can look at it in their brain. You can look at it in behavior. But then she gave them a test of generalization later on. What happens if you present an exemplar of one of these Finnish vowel harmony rules and you haven't seen before? In behavior, no one really shows much of anything. In the brain, what we see is the monolingual brains in California look more bilingual-like than the monolingual brains in Pennsylvania. The linguistic diversity in the surrounding environment may facilitate generalization following this difficult language learning task. So we don't know whether this, there are a lot of things we don't know because the study wasn't designed to look at this issue. It may be that these monolinguals in California have been hearing 2 languages or 3 languages or more for their entire lives. We don't know which feature of their environment is critical. Notably, the California monolinguals are lower SES than the Pennsylvania monolinguals. So from some perspectives, you might have viewed them as being disadvantaged from the start. So just to finish up, the story that I've been telling about L1 regulation reveals the variation in L2 language learning and reveals the very importance of variation and understanding this as a dynamic system. The L1 not only affects the L2, it is also affected by the L2. The dynamics differ across bilinguals and within bilinguals. From one environment, the same person may move from one environment to the next, and we observe differences in their performance. We believe that these differences reveal a system that adapts to the kind of interaction and competition that arises between the two languages. And we think that this individual variation and the focus of individual variation is very important in revealing these contributions. Now, I haven't said a word about the raging controversy in the field, and I haven't said a word because my purpose today was really to focus on thinking about how language itself might change in response to acquiring and using an L2. I want to argue that, or speculate that the regulation of the native language that we focused on may turn out to be critically important in understanding how the consequences of bilingualism arise and how they are manifest. And it's notable that we see differences vary in proficient bilinguals in different interactional contexts. The work on language suggests that if we begin to look at different interactional contexts for the longer term consequences of bilingualism, that they may reveal themselves not in a way that will necessarily be a one-to-one mapping, but in some ways that may give some insight to the differences that have been found across different studies, and that even for monolinguals who differ in these contexts. And so we need to capture the social and linguistic diversity of language to develop adequate models. The findings I've reported, I think, point to a set of possible mechanisms. It's not only that there are different types of bilinguals and monolinguals, but those differences have implications for how linguistic and cognitive resources are engaged. I think it's important to end with a note of humility, because I think there is a great deal that we do not understand. We don't know which of the dynamic changes we see in bilinguals are enduring and which are only a flash in the pan. We don't understand how evidence for new learning and changes in the brain that occur very quickly may lay a foundation for later learning, because very few of the studies that are done actually pursue what happens after those initial changes. We don't really understand, I think, the relation between language regulation and cognitive control. There are mechanisms that clearly overlap, but they are not identical. We also do not understand the relation between plasticity seen in early childhood, to go back to those initial data on why there may be age of acquisition effects. We don't understand how, if the constraints on adult second language learning are soft constraints, how we might provide a principled account of which effects depend on early exposure and which do not. And I haven't said anything much about whether the languages themselves really matter. So I want to end just by saying that we would know none of this if we studied monolinguals alone. And these implications are not just for our own curiosity. They require, I think, a revision of traditional stories about language development, about cognitive control, and about the plasticity associated with language experience. And I just want to say that we invite you to visit us in our laboratory at UC Irvine once the coast is clear and the world is safe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy, for this wonderful talk. I think we have plenty of time for questions right now, because you were really rushing through and trying to keep the time.
Keep track of
yes. So please, I want to open this virtual floor to questions now.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see everyone.
If anyone wants to start, please go ahead, and then all the next volunteers to ask questions, maybe you can identify yourself by raising a hand or chatting.
Yes, I'm happy to share the slides. I can send them.
I want to encourage the questions again.
I have a question.
Okay, Lucia. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, my name is Lucia Smith, and I'm a clinical professor at Midwestern University. And I had a question about, do we know much about these processes in children and the acquisition of language? Because I'm thinking specifically of the children that we work with who are primarily in monolingual families, who speak Spanish at home, and then they start school where they're learning English as an L2, and we often see that they demonstrate decreased Spanish skills as they're starting to learn English, and sometimes they get referred to speech therapy for that reason. And I wonder if it's just a language difference versus a language disorder.
Wait, if it's a language difference, or I didn't hear the second thing you said, or the language,
or a true language disorder that we would need to treat. So whether it's
I mean, there is, yeah, yeah, there's quite a bit of research that investigates this issue of how children who are switched from a home language environment into, immersion in the majority culture. I know that Antonella is here somewhere and has talked a lot about these issues. There is research that's come from communication disorders and work on speech pathology. So work of my colleague at Irvine, Elizabeth Pena, work of people like Leah Fabiano-Smith at University of Arizona have looked extensively, particularly for children from Spanish-speaking homes, to ask when is it a disorder and when is it kind of normal change that we see as a function of language development in bilingual children. And they've looked at this in some different ways because, of course, what the evidence shows is that children who are coming from homes where English is not, or where the dominant majority language is not the not the language spoken, will often be misdiagnosed for language disorders. And it can go both ways. So you can have both misses and false alarms. So you see children who don't have a language disorder who are diagnosed as having a disorder, and you see children who do have a disorder who may be missed entirely because of their bilingualism. And I think I don't work on this topic myself, but in what I've read, I think there are some very interesting studies looking at how you might see the way these differences would be manifest. So for example, in Leah Fabiano-Smith's work, she has a model that's basically based on the work that Janet Worker and her colleagues have done with infants exposed to two languages, arguing that for some aspects of the phonology and looking at the speech of these native Spanish-speaking children, what you see is that they are showing something that appears to be a deficit that isn't a deficit at all. It has to do with the way they speak English. And then for other contrasts, you see no effect, and then there are others where they're advantaged relative to monolingual English-speaking children. And so the issue is that we're at a very early stage, I think, of beginning to have the kind of theoretical grounding to then generate testing and assessment that allows us to ask the question of just how we should see what we should be looking for in this. And of course, another piece of this that's very critical is that all of the recent evidence on the home language suggests that these children are going to benefit by maintenance of the home language. And the evidence that's been reported on children who do maintain the home language. In fact, in that American Academy report that I cited early in the talk, there are data reported on English proficiency among children who came to a dual language immersion school early in elementary school. And not just how they maintain their home language, but how the maintenance of the home language advantaged them in English relative to children who were from the same cohort, but who were put into English immersion school. So I think there's a lot of work that's coming out that's beginning to reveal these differences. And I think Zofia, for your group, has a paper on this topic as well. I think that we're just beginning to identify what we need to know to be able to determine what is a disorder and what is not.
Thank you so much.
The next person in line is Ann Baker with the first question. And may I ask everyone who wants to raise the hand to raise the virtual hand rather than the physical hand? There is a way to raise the hand in the chat. Or please just write in the chat your question. So Ann Baker.
Thank you. I apologize for not having video. It's not working at the moment. But Judy, thank you so much for a very interesting talk. I work on the acquisition of sign languages in deaf children. And I'd like to know, often the effects that are reported for the interaction between, in bilingualism, between two spoken languages seem to pan out slightly differently between a signed language and a spoken language. And do you think that is because many deaf children are not exposed to a sign language with the same intensity or even at the same time, because deafness is diagnosed later and so on? Do you think that is the reason for not finding such clear effects in the population of bilingual deaf children?
I think it's complicated. I mean, I think that if we take a cue from the work on both deaf and hearing bimodal bilinguals, my interpretation is that there are more similarities than differences in the form of their bilingualism, but where those differences occur, I think that they are potentially significant. And of course, what you have when you have deaf children who haven't necessarily been exposed to sign language from the start, is that you have a situation that is very complicated many of the same issues that have come up in the literature on heritage speakers also apply to to deaf children, where you have to ask the question of whether they have actually acquired the language, or whether they, so whether you see differences in their use of the language as a function of whether they didn't have access to it, or whether whether there are interactions or even loss of something that they had at some point. I don't really think, I think the question of how these early experiences impact later learning is really important and relevant. I don't really think we know very much about the variation that occurs. I mean, I think we know something about the variation that occurs given that most deaf children are born to hearing parents. But I think understanding how that's going to then manifest itself later is tricky, and I think it's not that surprising that you don't see the same results for for deaf children as you do for for children coming from children who use spoken language coming from homes where the majority language is not the dominant language.
Okay, thank you very much.
I think that the next question comes from the chat. It was actually spelled out there, so let me just read it out loud. It's from Nabila. I was wondering if you have ever done work on learning difficulties in bilingual students. Is there a transfer of skill or deficiency? And if so, do you suspect that there will ever be a time that we tell people that it is not suggested for them to learn a second language?
Yeah, it's a very reasonable question, but I guess and again, I'm not a person who works on language, on learning itself, on learning disorders or learning difficulties in a way that would make me an expert in answering this sort of question. But I think that my read of the literature is that there's very little evidence that bilingualism in some contexts may have absolutely no effect. I think in other contexts, it seems very unlikely that the bilingualism of the student would really impose a selective learning difficulty. I tend to think, and maybe this is sort of a cheap shot, but I tend to think it's more in the mind of the listener than the producer. I think that if you have bilinguals who are in a context where their bilingualism is not supported, then you are more likely to see frequent diagnosis of learning problems. Again, for the same reason we see it with young bilingual children. And so I think that we need to sort out the environmental issues from the assessment issues.
Thank you very much. And then another question also comes from the chat. In regard to one of your last slides, do you find that the child and adult plasticity comes in part from motivation? That is, children having massive motivation to interact with caregivers and adults shaving less of this motivation and less plasticity?
I think that's a very good question. And I think that in many of the studies that we and other people are conducting, looking at language learning across the lifespan, including language learning in older adults, I think there is a genuine question about whether or not some of these effects are related to motivation. And I think I want to just make a distinction, which is that in this very last study that I presented on monolinguals in linguistically diverse environments, people hear that and they say, passive exposure does the job for you. I don't think linguistic diversity is necessarily a reflection of passive exposure. I think, in fact, there may be, linguistic diversity is also correlated with cultural diversity, and how that plays out in, active learning strategies is something I think we don't very well understand. I think motivation is crucial. I have to say that, and I know that Eleonora Rossi is here somewhere, we have a study where we're teaching native English speakers, again, Dutch, using Rosetta Stone software. And it's just an anecdotal result that we thought we would do part of the study in the Netherlands, where basically those of you who are in the Netherlands or familiar with the Netherlands know that it's not really necessary to learn to speak Dutch to get around. And the question is whether native English-speaking students who are in that environment are interested at all in learning to speak Dutch. And so we found a group of them who were not necessarily motivated to do that. And we gave them 10 days of Rosetta Stone training in Dutch. And at the end of it, they begged us for the software. Now, I do not want to advertise for Rosetta Stone or any other company, but what it suggests is that it may be very slippery to think about how to assess motivation. And I know a number of you have been involved in, Antonella, Thomas, those of you who've been involved in language learning studies in older adults know that there may be critical motivation. There's sort of a cause and effect issue here about motivation and how having this engaging learning task may interact with whatever the sort of initial judgment of motivation might be.
Thank you very much, Judy. And Laura is the next person who has been waiting for her turn.
Thank you so much, Zofia. Hi, thanks so much for a great talk. So my question is, sorry, let me just lower my hand. My question is, how do we differentiate between those, let's say, temporary effects that you describe and language attrition in general? So you showed that we know, you had this from the students who were in Spain, that when they got back, everything was fine. I'm just sort of, what we probably all do, all of us who are like multilinguals, like think about how this applies to yourself. And I can just say, like, now when I speak with my parents, I live in the US, I speak Dutch at home, but when I speak on the phone with my parents in Germany or with my friends, I often, forget words and so on. So, and I was like, oh my God, this is attrition. This is really bad. So yeah, so this is what made me wonder, like, okay, which aspect when do we say, okay, this is a momentarily,
I think it's a really important question. Yeah. And it's something that I would like to study. I mean, I think it's something we should be studying. I don't think we really understand, aside from, I mean, the attrition is sort of the big elephant in the room, right? I mean, right, we don't want to say attrition, but we don't understand in the current literature, one take on it, this is sort of a Saturday Night Live 5-minute routine on this. One take is that, you're exposed to another language, it doesn't matter how old you are, and within 5 minutes we see structural changes in the brain. And then we send the paper for publication and we're very excited. And so, I mean, these studies are fantastic, right? And then on the other hand, we have studies that look at long-term learning consequences over, I haven't read anything. I don't think anyone has a clue as to what the relationship is. So one possibility is that these kind of short-term intensive training studies actually reflect which mechanisms can be engaged that perhaps were not engaged in the same way. And the question we might want to ask is whether that then forms a foundation, a basis on which more enduring learning can occur. I don't think we know the answer to that question, but I think it's a really important question. So is it the case, for example, that if I take these monolinguals in Pennsylvania, we'll try not to feel too sorry for them, but the monolinguals in Pennsylvania, and now what we do is we plunk them down in a linguistically diverse environment during study abroad, or during, we bring them to California, which no one wants to come to California this week, but we bring them to California. Will they begin to show these environmental diversity effects? Or is it something that has to do with some enduring experience you've had over your life?
So following up on, so I was just wondering, following up on that, so what we need are sort of large longitudinal studies that follow people for like a long time and really cover all the different aspects of their
and we want the kind of studies, we don't want to have to do them ourselves, but we want some friend to do them, so we have those data. The problem is those studies are very punishing studies to do. They're very hard to do.
Speaking of attrition in terms of your participants also.
No, it's exactly. But I think understanding, and I have to say that I think there is a literature, and it's not one that I'm extremely well versed on, but there is a literature about plasticity and about issues of how, and certainly those of you who study aging know that there are questions about which aspects of early childhood plasticity can be reopened. And are there mechanisms that can be reopened? If they're reopened, is it the same mechanism that's reopening, or is it something different that happens? Now, in the end, sometimes we say it doesn't matter if people do things for the wrong reasons, as long as they do the right thing. And it may be that it doesn't matter in the end whether the mechanism is the same or not. But I think that we're just at a very early step of understanding it, but I think it's a really, really important, interesting question.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Thank you.
I think that there are 3 more questions waiting in the line. Judy, can you still be there with us? And
it's only 8:40 in the morning here. Yes, I have all day. No, it's not. No.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So the next question is also in the chat, and it reads as follows. Do you think that the effect on L1 is accrued more in vocabulary level or on grammar?
I think that, the examples that I've illustrated come primarily from lexical level examples, because we've done research on that topic, but I think that we see it in both. I think that there's an enduring important question for the grammar, about whether there are, again, whether there are, I use the term soft constraints, there may be some hard constraints. And in looking at studies of L2 learning in adults that have asked these questions, we see variation in which structures are chosen as to sort of illustrate whether things are more open than they seemed, or whether things are, in fact, as entrenched as claimed. And I guess I don't see that, you know, I don't think we can easily compare across the two. I think that there are, you know, there's certainly issues of the morphosyntax that have many of you have studied and that have been claimed to have constraints that may be harder than the example I gave of, you know, of relative clause attachment, and Antonella Sirachi's work on pronouns. I mean, we can, you know, we can think about what really constitutes a constraint and what doesn't. But I wanted to say one thing about the lexical level work. It's sometimes the case that people say, well, the lexicon's not interesting. I mean, the lexicon is really just, you know, anything goes, anyone can learn vocabulary, no big thing. I think that we as language scientists have actually learned quite a bit about bilingualism by studying lexicon. It's not enough, and these questions are hard and important questions, and understanding what's similar and different is absolutely crucial. But I think that if you think about people, I mean, people often said to me early in my career, you shouldn't be studying words. This is really, you know, this is impoverished. And if we had done the studies, we've now done the studies of what happens when we take language in context, I would argue that there's a profound set of observations that we've learned by studying the lexicon that we would not know otherwise. All this whole story about language non-selectivity, about cross-language activation is something that if we had only started in context, I don't think we would know that. It doesn't mean you can work up the line and then say, well, now we can go from the lexicon to the grammar. We have to look at all of these things together. And I think, yeah, I don't think we can say which one is going to be more revealing than the other. They tell us different things, and we need to begin to have theoretical accounts that will allow us to put them together.
Thank you, Judy. Another question also from the chat. What ideas do you have on how to measure domain general cognitive control versus linguistic control in bilinguals? Sometimes tasks limit our ability to distinguish between these two things.
Okay, I think that's a really important question. It's something that I think all of us and many of us are working on. And I think it's very clear in the literature, for example, on executive function, you see all of these controversies about what these tasks mean and how, you know, I think that we need to take inspiration from the recent neuroscience on network modeling. And the recent studies that have attempted to look at how language engages the networks of the brain and how cognitive tasks engage those networks. And my reading of it, and again, I'm not, I don't consider myself, you know, expert on that topic specifically, but I think that what we're beginning to see is that these language processes engage, they draw on cognitive resources that are going to be revealed by these cognitive, you know, the cognitive control measures, but they're not going to be identical. And so what we see is that the relationship between inhibition, attention, engagement, transfer, we have a set of ideas that are in play. And I think that we're only beginning to understand how the language portion of it, I think a lot of the research in the field has only focused on the cognitive control and has talked about language from the perspective of cognitive control. And I think the evidence that we have in the recent, even just last 5 years, and by we, I don't mean me personally or my lab personally, but all of us working on these problems, I think is beginning to show that there is coordination across these different measures. So in the slide that I went whizzing by on prediction, that was a study led by Megan Zernstein, looking at prediction processes and language processing with Chinese English bilinguals. And she used a measure, she used that AXCT measure that I showed you, which is this proactive reactive control. It's a cognitive measure, it's not a language measure. And then she used verbal fluency, which is the measure that I've been using here to show that, you know, the L1 takes a hit. What she discovered is you need to have both together to be able to account for brain activity in these Chinese English bilinguals while they're making predictions in sentence context. Over and over again, what we're seeing in the recent study is that you need to have both, suggesting that they are not perfectly redundant. They interact, they draw on each other, but they are not perfectly redundant. And I think that we are just beginning to understand, you know, how that works. And I do think that the inspiration from these network modeling studies is where I think we need to be looking to have a more nuanced view of what these different language and cognitive processes are telling us.
Thank you very much, Judy. And the next chat is actually a comment rather than a question that comes from Sharon Arman-Lotem, and it's related to the disorders and diagnosis of the disorders. Sharon, do you want to comment on this verbally?
Well, I can if you want me to. I mean, basically what I was saying is there's lots of work coming from the cost action that I led some years ago in Europe about the issue of bilingualism and on the one hand, and developmental language disorder or specific language impairment, choose your terminology for this, showing that there's no reason to assume that it is exacerbating the performance. So there's a problem of being bilingual, and if you have a developmental language disorder, likewise, there are studies about this, in the context of autism and the context of Down syndrome. So I cannot talk about school age population with learning disabilities because I don't know about it, but there is ample of evidence for preschool children that there's no reason to avoid bilingualism, even if there is a disorder. So this was my little comment.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
And if I say one more thing, there's also evidence on how to differentiate disorder from typical development, bilingual development, pointing to the need to refer to both languages, not just one language of the child, and include other aspects of language.
And my colleague Elizabeth Pena is doing exactly, their work is doing exactly that, to have measures. This is for Latino children, and in fact they're developing them now for Vietnamese children, to have measures that do exactly that, so we don't assume that we should be assessing them in the majority language, because that itself will lead to some very distorted views of what's a disorder and what's not. Yeah.
Thank you, Sharon and Judy. And the next question is, what do we know about how definition of who is bilingual affects our findings in this population?
I think this is sort of the, you know, it used to be called the $64 million question or whatever, but we know that no longer seems like a lot of money to anybody. I think that, you know, yeah, I mean, who's bilingual? And I think that we need to look at there's a number of people are working very hard on this issue. Gigi Luck's lab has a set of papers on trying to think about how we characterize who we consider to be bilingual. In the I think in the work that I've described today, we take a very broad approach to say that anyone who's actively learning or using two languages is bilingual, but obviously differently bilingual, and people are bilingual in different ways. And I think it's a really, really important point, and I think understanding how bilingualism is manifest and recognizing that for the very same individual, it may change over the course of their life, depending upon the context in which they find themselves, I think is important. And we have moved quite far from the sort of traditional view that, you know, the only bilinguals were, early and balanced bilinguals. There are no balanced bilinguals because balance is really a very, very slippery idea. And I think we're beginning to learn more about this, but one of the consequences, of course, is that it makes research more complicated. And we now have the statistical tools to be able to analyze continuous effects in ways that we couldn't easily do in the past. And I think that that will enable these kinds of distinctions to be, to be understood in ways that I think we are just beginning to address.
Thank you, Judy. And the last question that we can take is also from the chat, and I'm going to read it out loud. Do you think that in order to promote second language learning based on language adaptation hypothesis, is it a good idea to try not to use L1 in the language classroom as much as possible? In other words, should selective attention be directed to L2 processing rather than L1?
Well, that's the classic logic of having immersion classrooms. And I think there's a very interesting question about how to think about that. I think that in some contexts, immersion learning can be quite effective. I also think that we can take some cue from our colleagues in education, and some of you may come from this perspective and know a lot more about it than I do, but I think there's a really interesting discussion around issues of translanguaging, about the idea of using whatever language works in a given situation and not trying to segregate our experience into one language or the other. And I have to say that given the naturalness of code switching that until recently has been highly stigmatized, I tend to think that there may be selective immersion contexts that are effective in learning, but I think that I would not go so far as to say that the L1 should not be used. I think if what learners are learning is to regulate the L1, then they need to be trying to use the L1 in a context where they're faced with the L2. So there needs to be some, some conflict present at some level. But I'm just speaking off the top of my head because I'm not a person who's in the classroom trying to implement these kinds of models of education.
Thank you, Judy. There is one more question in the chat. Can we take it?
Sure.
Do you think linguistic distance matters? And have you studied bilectal children?
Okay. Do I think linguistic distance matters? Okay, so we haven't studied dialectal differences, but I think everything I know about that research, and of course there's less research than there is on bilingualism, but I think everything we know suggests that it operates in a pretty similar way. So I don't think there's any principled basis on which to argue that it should be different. It may impose different cognitive demands on the learner, but I think it's otherwise similar. The linguistic distance question comes up in every single talk I've ever given, and it's a really important question. I don't want to say that linguistic distance, typology doesn't matter. I think it does. I don't think it matters for everything. And I think at the level that we are modeling, I think that there are more striking similarities than differences. And I think that, again, I think we have to take that question about linguistic distance and place it in the framework of understanding interactional context. But I think that there are, clear differences. Many of the studies that we've done on languages that do not share the same writing systems. We have studies on American Sign Language and English, which are completely different from one another? And do they impose exactly the same demands, cognitive demands on bilingual, bimodal bilinguals? No. But do they function similarly otherwise? Do they interact with one another in this dynamic way? I think yes, they do. And so there's very little that we see that suggests that linguistic distance per se may constrain the form of these interactions. It doesn't mean it doesn't influence them, but I don't think it determines their presence. I think their presence is determined at a much more abstract level by what it means to be bilingual.
Judy, thank you so much for this wonderful and inspiring talk. There are many thank yous in the chat as well. We are really very grateful for your time and just staying with us over time as well. And last but not least, waking up at 5 a.m. in the morning to be here with us today. Thank you so much, Judy.
Well, thank you very much for having me and for these wonderful questions. It's really perfect focus of discussion. We all have a lot of work to do. So thank you.